The winter of 1945 marked the final, desperate chapter of Nazi Germany. As Allied forces pushed across the Rhine and into the German heartland, they encountered not only fierce resistance, but also complex moral challenges that would test the very foundation of military medical ethics. Among these dilemmas was a scenario few American medical personnel had prepared for: providing life-saving care to wounded SS officers, men who represented the most fanatical and brutal elements of Hitler's regime. Along the muddy roads of Western Germany, as the 3rd Armored Division advanced through small towns and villages, an American reconnaissance unit discovered the aftermath of what appeared to be an internal German firefight. Among the wounded were 3 high-ranking SS officers, their black uniforms and distinctive insignia immediately recognizable to the American soldiers who secured the area. "I remember the tension in the air when we realized who we'd found," recalled Lieutenant Robert Garrison, a medical officer attached to the unit. "These weren't ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. The SS lightning bolts on their collars represented everything we'd been fighting against." The immediate reaction from some infantry soldiers was predictable: cold contempt, muttered suggestions that perhaps medical resources shouldn't be wasted on such men. Reports from military archives describe how one private openly stated that the officers should be left to die, considering the atrocities committed by SS units throughout occupied Europe. But military protocol was clear. Captain James Miller, the senior medical officer present, ordered immediate first aid and evacuation to the nearest field hospital. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't make exceptions for the enemy, no matter how despicable, Miller would later write in his personal journal. In that moment, they were patients, not prisoners. The mobile surgical hospital, located 10 miles behind the front lines, was already overwhelmed with American casualties from recent fighting. The arrival of severely wounded SS officers created an immediate tension that rippled through the medical facility. Blood plasma, antibiotics, and surgical equipment were all precious commodities. Every resource used to save an SS officer meant potentially less for Allied wounded. Hey folks, I really appreciate you watching this historical account. If you're finding this documentary valuable, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming episodes on untold Bigputu stories. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know what part of the country or world you're tuning in from. Now, back to those crucial moments in 1945. The American field hospital system had evolved dramatically throughout the war. By early 1945, it operated with remarkable efficiency. Mobile surgical units positioned close to combat zones, evacuation chains with specialized ambulances, and an organized triage system designed to maximize survival rates. This system, originally designed primarily for Allied soldiers, now faced the moral complexity of treating men known to have participated in war crimes. Army Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Collins described the scene. "We had American boys with terrible injuries waiting. And then these SS men were brought in. The doctors didn't hesitate, though. The most critical cases went first, regardless of uniform. That's how we operated." Military medical records from February 1945 document the extensive injuries sustained by the SS officers. One had suffered a penetrating chest wound with significant blood loss. Another had multiple fragmentation wounds and a traumatic amputation below the knee. The 3rd officer had sustained a severe head injury with exposed brain matter. All 3 required immediate surgery to survive. "These weren't simple wound treatments," explained Major Thomas Reynolds, one of the surgeons who operated that day. "We're talking about complex procedures requiring hours of surgical time, precious blood supplies, and specialized post-operative care, all while knowing exactly who these men were." The battlefield triage decisions followed established protocols. Medical personnel assessed injuries based on severity and likelihood of survival, not rank or nationality. This principle, while medically sound, created profound ethical tension among the hospital staff. Private First Class William Harrington, a medic who assisted during surgery, later recounted, "I had lost 3 buddies the week before to SS snipers. Now I was helping save the life of an SS officer. The doctor saw my hands shaking and just said, 'Remember why you wear that red cross, son.'" Military police established a secure perimeter around the SS officers' recovery area. Armed guards were posted at all times, both to prevent escape attempts and to protect the prisoners from potential retaliation by Allied soldiers or other patients. The officers were segregated from regular German Wehrmacht prisoners, who themselves often expressed disgust at being associated with the SS. Army chaplain Father Michael Donnelly observed, "I witnessed American doctors working through exhaustion to save men who, in another context, they would have considered morally reprehensible." It was perhaps the purest demonstration of medical ethics I've ever seen, treating the wound, not judging the man. As word spread through the hospital of the high-ranking SS patients, medical personnel faced difficult questions from their own wounded. How could the same blood plasma that could save an American boy from Kansas be used for an SS officer who had overseen atrocities? The doctor's consistent answer referenced the Geneva Convention and medical ethics, but these explanations often felt insufficient in the face of raw emotion. Captain Miller would later write, "In those moments, medicine transcended the war. We weren't making statements about forgiveness or justice. Those would come later in courts. We were simply upholding the principle that medical care is rendered based on human need, not human worth." As the SS officers stabilized under American medical care, military intelligence officers began preparing for their eventual interrogation. Documents seized from their personal effects already suggested connections to concentration camp operations. These men, saved by American medical expertise, would likely face military tribunals and possible execution once recovered. The irony wasn't lost on the medical personnel. They were restoring health to men who might soon face the gallows, all while adhering to principles that distinguished American military medicine from the perverted medical practices of Nazi doctors themselves. "We treated them," Nurse Collins later reflected, "not because we believed they deserved mercy, but because we refused to abandon our own humanity, even in the face of theirs." And Dun, the wounded SS officers, were segregated from other German POWs almost immediately upon arrival at the field hospitals. Medical staff had quickly established separate treatment areas, often using canvas partitions or placing them in secured corners of medical tents. This segregation served multiple purposes: protection of the SS officers from potential violence from other prisoners, prevention of escape attempts, and isolation of individuals who might still harbor fanatical loyalty to the Nazi regime. Captain Howard Miller, a field hospital administrator with the 44th Evacuation Hospital, recalled the tension that permeated these segregated areas. "We had to post armed guards around the clock. These weren't just any prisoners. These were men wearing the lightning bolts who had done unspeakable things, but in our hospital beds, they were patients first." The security measures implemented for these high-value prisoners were substantial. Military police maintained constant surveillance, with armed guards positioned at all entrances and exits to treatment areas. The SS officers, even when heavily sedated or immobilized by their wounds, were often restrained to their beds with leather straps or handcuffs when their medical condition permitted. Dog tags and other identification were removed and placed in sealed evidence bags, as these items might later serve as evidence in war crimes investigations. The field hospitals resembled small fortresses when housing SS leadership. Lieutenant James Barker of the military police recalled, "We constructed a perimeter of sandbags around their ward. No one got in without proper clearance, and certainly no one got out. We checked credentials 3 times over. For the medical personnel, treating these patients presented profound ethical challenges. Army Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Daniels wrote in her journal, "Today, I changed bandages on an SS Sturmbannführer with extensive burns. His fever was spiking to 104. I found myself hesitating before administering morphine, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the camps our boys had liberated. Then I remembered why I wear this uniform and gave him the medication as prescribed." Medical procedures were meticulously documented, sometimes more thoroughly than for Allied soldiers. This excessive documentation served as protection for medical staff, proof that they had followed protocols and provided appropriate care regardless of the patient's affiliation. Surgeries, medication administration, and daily vital signs were recorded in duplicate, with one set of records accompanying the prisoner and another retained by the hospital command. Major David Rothstein, a Jewish-American surgeon who operated on several high-ranking SS officers, described the cognitive dissonance. "I performed abdominal surgery on a man who would have sent me to a death camp without hesitation. My hands didn't shake. My technique didn't falter. That's when I knew that medicine transcends everything, even the deepest hatred. The procedures performed range from emergency life-saving interventions to routine care. Bullet extractions, amputation of gangrenous limbs, treatment of severe burns, and management of traumatic brain injuries were common. Blood transfusions, often using the same American blood supply designated for Allied troops, were administered when necessary. Penicillin, still relatively new and precious, was allocated according to medical need rather than prisoner status. Across the makeshift recovery wards, military chaplains made their rounds, offering spiritual comfort to all wounded, including the SS officers. Captain Francis O'Malley, a Catholic chaplain attached to the 128th Evacuation Hospital, noted in his memoir, "Some refused to speak to me. Others, facing death, sought absolution. I provided last rites to 3 SS men in April of 45. God's mercy extends even to those who showed none." The psychological toll on American medical personnel was significant. Regular rotation schedules were implemented to prevent burnout among staff assigned to the SS officer wards. Weekly group discussions led by psychiatrists allowed medical personnel to process their complex emotions. Some requested transfers, unable to reconcile their professional obligations with personal knowledge of Nazi atrocities. Captain Eleanor Richards, chief nurse at a field hospital near Frankfurt, instituted a buddy system among her nursing staff. No nurse entered the secure ward alone, not for safety reasons but for moral support. It's one thing to dress the wounds of an enemy soldier, it's another to care for men who orchestrated genocide. Other wounded soldiers in these facilities often reacted with disbelief or anger upon learning that SS officers were receiving treatment alongside them. Private First Class Michael Donoghue, recovering from shrapnel wounds at a field hospital in Belgium, wrote home, "They keep them behind screens on the far side of the tent. Sometimes you hear them speaking German. The docs say they have to treat them, something about Geneva rules. Hard pill to swallow when you've seen what I've seen." Hospital administrators walked a fine line between upholding medical ethics and acknowledging the legitimate grievances of Allied personnel. Some implemented strict scheduling to ensure SS officers and Allied soldiers would not be transported to surgical theaters simultaneously. Others designated specific medical teams who volunteered for the difficult assignment of treating Nazi leadership. Throughout this process, intelligence officers maintained a constant presence in the recovery wards, gathering information even from delirious patients. Colonel William Richards of Army Intelligence described these efforts. "We stationed Russian-speaking and German-speaking personnel in nursing roles. The SS men often spoke freely during recovery from anesthesia or when fever broke their resistance. Some of our most valuable intelligence about remaining Nazi resistance came from these bedside conversations. As the SS officers began to recover, military legal teams prepared for the next phase. Photographers documented scars, tattoos, and identifying marks. Medical personnel were debriefed about any statements made during treatment. Recovery progress was carefully monitored, as these men would soon face military tribunals and potentially execution for their roles in the Third Reich's crimes. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, American military medical personnel largely adhered to the standards of care established by their training and the Geneva Convention. Major General Paul Hawley, chief surgeon of the European Theatre of Operations, later reflected, "Our medical personnel faced the ultimate test of their professional ethics. By treating the architects of evil with the same clinical standards we afforded our own men, they demonstrated the moral strength of our nation. This wasn't weakness, it was our greatest strength." As spring turned to summer in 1945, the recovered SS officers were gradually transferred from medical facilities to detention centers, specifically designed to hold high-ranking Nazi prisoners. They departed on stretchers and in wheelchairs under heavy guard to face judgment for their actions. Behind them, they left medical teams forever changed by the experience of healing those who had caused so much harm. As the German SS officers recuperated in Allied field hospitals, a complex system of processing began. Military police units designated for prisoner control established detailed documentation chains for each captured SS officer. Their medical charts, which tracked treatment and recovery, were now joined by military intelligence files that would follow them to detention centers throughout Allied-controlled territory. The transfer of these recovered Nazi officers from medical facilities to detention compounds happened under heavy security. American MPs, still wary of desperate escape attempts, transported them in convoys of olive-drab trucks and jeeps. Many were moved to temporary holding facilities near Mannheim and Frankfurt, while higher-ranking officers with suspected direct knowledge of atrocities were sent to specialized interrogation centers. Captain Robert Williams, who served with the 132nd Evacuation Hospital, recalled the procedure. "Once they were stable enough for transport, we coordinated with MPs who arrived with paperwork in triplicate. These weren't regular POWs. Everyone understood the gravity of having SS men under our care. The handoff procedures were meticulous, with medical summaries included, so detention facilities could continue necessary treatments. While the wounded SS officers recovered, specialized units from the War Crimes Investigation Team worked methodically to collect evidence. These teams, composed of military lawyers, investigators, and translators, often interviewed the officers while they were still in medical care, documenting their unit affiliations, command structures, and deployment histories. Major Thomas Hancock of the Judge Advocate General's Office described this delicate process. "We needed to establish evidence chains while these men were accessible, but we had to coordinate with medical staff. We'd wait until doctors cleared an officer for questioning, usually conducting interviews in a secured ward, with a medical officer present to ensure the prisoner's condition wasn't compromised." This evidence-gathering phase proved crucial for subsequent proceedings. Investigators photographed distinctive SS tattoos, collected personal items with unit insignia, and documented verbal testimony. They cross-referenced prisoner statements with captured Nazi documents and testimonies from liberated concentration camp survivors. For SS officers implicated in specific atrocities, military tribunals became their destination. The infrastructure for these proceedings had been established even before Germany's surrender, with the international community preparing legal frameworks for prosecuting war crimes at unprecedented scale. The tribunals, particularly those at Nuremberg and Dachau, became the most visible manifestations of this justice system. But hundreds of smaller proceedings occurred throughout occupied Germany. The medical personnel who had treated these SS officers sometimes found themselves called to testify. Their testimony often addressed two critical aspects: the prisoner's physical condition during captivity and any statements made during treatment that might have evidential value. Lieutenant Sarah Kensington, an army nurse who served at a field hospital near Remagen, described her unexpected role. "I never imagined I'd be sitting in a military courtroom, but I testified in 3 separate cases. They wanted to know if the prisoners had been treated humanely under our care, which of course they had been, and if any of them had spoken about their activities while medicated or during recovery. The medical records themselves became important legal documents. Tribunal prosecutors used them to establish timelines, verify prisoners' identities, and demonstrate that due process had been followed even with the most notorious captives. Defense attorneys occasionally challenged the admissibility of statements made under medication, creating complicated legal questions about evidence obtained during medical treatment. For American military medicine, these experiences catalyzed formal codifications of battlefield ethics that would influence generations of medical personnel. The lessons learned treating enemy wounded, especially those implicated in atrocities, were incorporated into training materials and field manuals. Medical schools at military academies developed specialized courses addressing the ethical dimensions of treating enemy combatants. Colonel Harold Freeman, who later helped develop medical ethics curricula at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, reflected, "What emerged from those difficult days was a deeper understanding of our profession's obligations. We recognized that maintaining our ethical standards, especially when treating those who had abandoned their own humanity, defined who we were as a nation and as a medical service." The experience affected individual medical personnel in profound ways. Some struggled with knowing they had saved individuals who had orchestrated mass killings. Others found affirmation in having upheld their professional principles under the most challenging circumstances. Many carried these experiences into their post-war medical careers, where they influenced civilian medical ethics. Dr. William Cartwright, who treated several SS officers in a field hospital near Munich, later wrote, "I entered medical practice in Cleveland after the war, and found myself drawing on those experiences whenever I faced ethical dilemmas. Having maintained your principles when treating someone you know has committed atrocities gives you a certain moral clarity that serves you well in civilian practice." The American approach contrasted somewhat with those of other Allied nations. Soviet forces typically provided minimal medical care to SS personnel before transferring them to labor camps. British medical units maintained similar standards to American ones, though with more limited resources. The French, with fresh memories of occupation, sometimes struggled to maintain equitable treatment, particularly in areas where resistance fighters had assumed local control. The legacy of these medical decisions extended well beyond the immediate post-war period. When American military medicine confronted new challenges in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts, the ethical framework established during those encounters with wounded SS officers provided guidance. The principle that medical care should be provided based on medical need rather than political, military, or personal considerations became fundamental to military medical training. Today, military medical ethics courses still reference these historical examples. At the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, medical students analyze case studies from W22 field hospitals to understand the complex intersection of medical ethics and warfare. The experiences of those doctors and nurses who treated wounded SS officers, knowing the atrocities they had committed, continue to inform discussions about maintaining humanitarian principles amid conflict. As one medical historian observed, In choosing to treat even the most despised enemies according to the same standards they would apply to their own wounded, American medical personnel demonstrated that civilization's most fundamental values could survive even the most destructive conflict in human history. Their ethical choice represented a quiet victory in a war that tested humanity's moral foundations.